last Bible study, we had Book of Revelation, the introduction. And there we had 3 parts of it for the going through the story flow of introduction. And we introduced the idea of the 7 seals. We looked at the 7 trumpets. We did not discuss the 7th trumpet in detail, but about the 7 vials or 7 bowls. And then, of course, the culmination, which is the return of Jesus Christ. So those are the 3 things in the last Bible study for introducing the story flow of the book of Revelation. I just found this morning, I found on the UCG website a graphic that put this timeline out into place. So if you just type into ucg.org and go to timeline of end time events, you can pull this one up. I'll give you some detail. But we're going to go over, continue on where we left off last time. So I've labeled this one called the timeline, Book of Revelation timeline. But I do want to review first. What did we do last time? And that was, we looked at the 7 seals. We looked at what would occur in the book of Revelation, the religious deception, the war, the famine, the disease epidemics, tribulation, heavenly signs, and then the 7th trumpet, or the 7 trumpets. So we looked at that last time. Then we looked at the 7 trumpets, called the day of the Lord, the destruction of vegetation, about oceans, sea life, about the waters, the sun, moon, and stars, the human afflictions, military destruction. And then we referred to the 7 last plagues, but we didn't go over those. And so today I want to go through those on the 7th trump is really what we call 7 last plagues. Now, if we take a look at that, those are described, and we're going to turn to Revelation 16. You might want to open your Bible because we're going to step through a number of the verses in Revelation 16 where it refers to those plagues as being bowls or vials being poured out. Now, the language will change slightly with the translation, but whether I think it's the New King James reads bowls, the original King James reads vials, and then it goes through and explains each one of those. So the first plague says sores on beast worshippers. Well, we need to have a little more understanding of who a beast worshiper is, but let's take a look at Revelation 16 in verses 1 and 2 to understand the first plague in the 7 plagues. Now, when I go through these, I do want to understand that when young people hear this, all they see is woe and grief and agony, and who would want to believe in a system like that? Because this is all particularly scary. Well, I did read, as others have, to the end of the book, and God shows us how we can all become winners, how this is simply a process by which those who have understanding will recognize that there will be a grand and a glorious end. So let's take a look at this first plague in Revelation 16 and verse 1. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, "Go and pour out the bowls of wrath of God on the earth." So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon the man who had the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. Well, about this time you say, well, it's pretty important. We don't want to be one of those who have the mark of the beast, that worship his image. So you'll find a lot of writing in Christianity and in end-time prophecies, and they're looking deep as to how to identify the beast, who has the mark of the beast, and so forth. Well, that's one of the reasons. Who wants to be afflicted by some loathsome and foul disease? So the first plague then would be a sore on the beast worshippers. The second plague then, and this is kind of shocking, it says the oceans became blood. Well, we're already in Revelation 16, so let's take a look at verse 3. As the second angel poured his bowl out on the sea, it became blood as of a dead man, and every living creature on the sea died. Now, 3/4 of the earth is covered by water, and the oceans are filled with plankton and other creatures, little floating plants that produce oxygen for the rest of us to breathe. Well, if you eliminate all the life forms in the sea, you're going to greatly reduce the oxygen capacity on Earth. Well, that's pretty important stuff, since everybody here that I know of breathes oxygen. If we breathe nitrogen, that would be less of an issue. 80% of our air is nitrogen. Hey, we're still good. But we breathe oxygen. That's about 20% of our air. Kind of important to have that renewable source. So we're looking here now, whether it's actual blood or not, that's for another time. But we do know that it says every living creature in the sea will die. The third plague, and if we read on then in Revelation 16:4, well, you say, well, the oceans can be renewed. We've got springs, we've got streams and rivers, and that will renew the ocean. But what happens is that also becomes as blood. In Revelation 16:4, and the third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. And then I heard the angel of the waters saying, "You are righteous, O Lord, the one who is, who was, and who is to be, because you've judged these things. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, for it is their just due." So we have now a consequence of the ones who have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets. This is their reward. In other words, the end of life-giving. And so we have this third angel that says the oceans aren't going to be renewed when the rivers and fresh water become polluted. Now, I met a guy, I was at Walmart greeter some years ago, and it was the same old fellow. And I got to know him after a number of visits, and for some reason we just kind of struck up a conversation. And this was, like I say, was years ago. And so a little tidbit about his life or mine as we passed by, and he was explaining that he had drilled a well because he couldn't get good water in the rural area. He didn't have good rural water. It wasn't close to him, so he drilled a well. And then a neighbor came by and bought the property next to his and put in a septic system. He was very unhappy about that. And he says, if my well gets polluted, somebody's going to jail. Well, I got the idea that he was really unhappy that, well, can you imagine the well is, when it turns bad, well, what happens if all the streams turns bad and available? Now, like I say, we can look at this both physically and spiritually. Their source of good water physically, as well as their a source of renewal of God's Spirit, may be very limited. And that's speculation because we can just read what we read. The fourth plague. This sounds uncomfortable. The sun scorches the earth. Now, there's a reason I don't live in Arizona. Sorry if anybody listening on the webcast or here delaying likes the hot areas. That's not me. But the fourth plague about the sun scorching the earth in Revelation 16, verses 8 and 9. And the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and the power was given to him to scorch men with fire. Now, this is interesting because there are sunspots. These are literally storms on the surface of the sun, and they affect the climate on the earth. In fact, all of the climatic changes that have been around for thousands of years, a lot of them can be directly related to the history of sunspots or activity on the sun surface. It says the sun scorches the earth. Well, it takes 8 minutes for the light to get from the sun to the earth. Verse 9, and the men were scorched with great heat, and they blasphemed the name of God who has the power over these plagues, and they did not repent or give him glory. Now, you would think at this point that somebody would say, look, we've got all these plagues, things aren't going well for us, and there is an old saying that there's no atheist in a foxhole. When things are really bad and desperate, you would think they would turn to a creator, and now it might be a good time to pray, even if you're an agnostic. Hey, you can't lose, right? So giving it a shot. And yet, what did they do? They blasphemed God. They blamed God. In fact, that's happened throughout history. When things go wrong, people tend to blame God. We'll look at a future message on the things that people blame God about. Because now when they blame God, they're acknowledging, number one, they acknowledge God, and number two, the power that God has over these things. And yet they still do not repent and give God the glory for being the God that he is. They don't realize it was their own efforts that have lent to this problem. So we've got this fourth plague, the sun scorches the earth. Now we go to the fifth plague, and there's thick darkness in the beast kingdom. Oh, well, that's kind of an unusual one. Let's take a look at Revelation 16, verses 10 and 11. In Revelation 16, verse 10 and 11, the fifth angel poured his bowl out on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues because of the pain. Living life without the knowledge and understanding of God leads people to pain, leads people to problems. Notice it says poured it out on the throne of the beast. That's the beast power that we have, the beast power and the kingdom, who's ever under control of that, full of darkness. They don't have the light of God. It's a spiritual darkness. And I presume it will also be a physical darkness. And they will be in pain. It says, gnawed their tongues. How do they know what to say? That's got to be awkward. Verse 11, they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores and did not repent of their deeds. They still haven't figured it out. They still are blaming God. And by blaming God, they're acknowledging God's presence and power. So that's the fifth plague. Now we look at the sixth plague, the Euphrates River drying up. Now, what does that matter to us? What do we got? We live near the White River. In fact, right on the runs by our place for less than 1,000 feet of riverfront. So that's the river we're worried about. What do we care if there were Euphrates rivers? And after all, who knows how to spell Euphrates, much less know where it's at? So I thought I would pop up the explanation on it in Revelation 16, verse 12. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. Well, the river is an obstacle for people coming to the east. So let's take a look at a map. And if we take a look at a map, in the center of this map is the Euphrates River. On the left side of the map is Israel and the Mediterranean Sea. To the right side of the map is where you would have to come if you were bringing an army from India or China or Central Asia. They would have to cross. The Euphrates River starts in Turkey, travels through Syria, all the way through present-day Iraq, and empties into the Persian Gulf. So if that river were dried up, just drive vehicles across it. So, and we clearly heard that it was there so that the kings of the east, or the power of the east, could come. So that river drying up, and it's a huge river. If you've driven across the Mississippi or other rivers, this is emptying the waters, the whole mountain plateau between Turkey, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, this whole plateau of mountains up there where the mountains of Ararat, where the ark landed millennia ago. So that's to have that river dried up, which to my knowledge has never dried up before, would be a dramatic happening. Then we take a look then at the seventh plague. Now, mind you, all of these plagues occur during the seventh time of the power of the seventh trumpet, and we have massive final destruction. Well, what does that mean? Let's take a look in Revelation 16, verse 17 and 18. Revelation 16, verse 17 and 18. And the seventh angel poured his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty great earthquake as has not occurred since men were on the earth. Well, I remember hearing a lot about earthquakes through the years and around the world, and perhaps you have as well. So let's continue on with this Revelation 16. Let's move on to Revelation 19 through 20. Now the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And the great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of wine of the fierceness of his wrath. In other words, especially upon Babylon. And then every island fled away and the mountains were not found. That's a lot of drama, but let's take a look. Now, some of you may remember that Mount St. Helens on May 18th, 1980, about 10:30 in the morning, I was about 120 miles away when it blew. And 1/3 of the mountain was pulverized into fine bits of ash. They said like powdered glass. Well, when it tells us that the mountains were not found, if you look over the horizon, it's going to be hard to find Mount St. Helens today because it's greatly lowered. 1/3 of it blew away. There's a mountain in southern Oregon called Mount Mazama. Nobody's climbed to the top of Mount Mazama because now we call it Crater Lake, where the top third of the mountain blew away. It's pulverized, as it were, into what we would think of as powdered glass. Now, I did drive I did fly after Mount St. Helens blew in 1980, and I flew from Portland, Oregon to the Minneapolis, St. Paul. And when I got off the airplane in the Twin Cities, I heard two pilots that had just gotten off the plane, and they were talking to people on the ground, and they said, the engines looked like they were scoured with a sandblaster because the amount of powdered glass that was still in the air. So there was a lot, and so I had an opportunity later, 1 year later, to drive to make that trip. And I was driving from Oregon up to Spokane, Washington, and across the United States. Well, the prevailing winds took from Mount St. Helens in Washington, just north of Portland, Oregon, and the winds carried it to the east, all the ash, and I'm looking in the ditch, the road ditch of the highway and the freeway. And this is June, and it looked like the snowbanks had been receding. There was a foot or two of what looked like snowbanks. And I got out, and I went over, and I realized with horror, that was the ash that was residual from Mount St. Helens that had not yet washed away. It was a very traumatic and dramatic event. I lived, like I say, about 120 miles south of it. And the prevailing winds only blow that way 6% of the time, so I didn't have an issue. But when I landed from the plane in Minnesota after the blast, you could write your name on the dust on the cars. And there was enough abrasive that your name would stay. You would have, your finger would do that. So can you imagine then the mountains not found? Enormous amount of damage. If we look in the pages of history, most of you do not know where Samarkand, Uzbekistan is. Try to find Uzbekistan on a map. It's in South Central Asia. But it was the home or the capital of the last great nomadic conqueror called Tamerlane, which was the English version of Timur the Lame, their leader. And he conquered from Europe to India, and he was trying to conquer China upon his death in the late 1200s. The reason we don't see much of Samarkand left is because of the shaking of the earthquakes that have destroyed the buildings in that area, destroyed by earthquakes. And then we read of the ancient Greek city of Atlantis. It somehow disappeared under the ocean. Who can find Atlantis? So we've got bits and pieces of evidence of islands that have fled away, the mountains not found. So, and this is massive final destruction. But wait, there's more. Let's read on in verse 21, Revelation 16 and verse 21. We've got, and great hail from heaven fell upon the men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Now, I didn't look up the weight of a talent, but I do know that hailstones the size of a dime can cause a lot of damage, or a nickel or a quarter, or a silver dollar. Talent is a certain weight of currency. And we read on in this verse, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. Now, as some of you can see the damage of what hail can do. I took my car to an auto electric place some years ago. to get some auto electric work done, and I saw a car in the shop they had there. It was just like my car, except that it had been hit by hail, and it looked like dimples all over the car, like you had taken a hammer and just dimpled the whole car up. I'm presuming that this hail might be a little greater than that because the plague was exceedingly great, as we read in this verse. But let's take a look. This isn't the only time that hail has fallen on the earth as in a plague. And if we take a look in the Exodus 9, in verses 22 to 26, we read of the seventh plague in Egypt. In Exodus 9, verses 22 to 26. And the hailstones that fell, it's interesting, they called hail and fire mixed with hail. In fact, there's some song that came out a few years back that had both fire and rain. And this hails back, bad choice of word, good choice of word, hails back to this time. That hail stuck throughout in verse 25, struck through out the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, man and beast, and the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. That's a lot of hail. But only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. So we have this prototype, this previous plague in Egypt. So when this time comes that it mentions in Revelation is a time that's worse than anything we've had before. And we already read here that afflicting man and beast and struck every herb of the field and broke trees. That's a lot of hail. So we can see why it's called the massive final destruction, or is described as that in Revelation 16. So what are these last plagues on the seventh trumpet? They're called bowls or vials, depending on which translation you read. The sores on beast worshippers. You might say a plague or a pandemic there. The oceans become blood, whether it's literal or figurative. That means they would lose their life-giving capacity. Rivers and fresh water become blood, all in Revelation 16. That the oceans are not being refreshed with fresh water. We looked at the sun scorching the earth. That will have an effect on the ability to produce food, to stay warm or cold in seasons. Then we look at thick darkness in the beast kingdom. Now, this darkness, whether it's physical darkness or spiritual darkness, but since it's right after the sun scorching the earth, we don't know. Does that mean the earth changed on its axis? And so there's darkness on part of it and scorched on the other part? It's all speculation as to how that will play it out. But what we do know is what we read plainly is that there will be a time or a period of darkness. Then we look at the Euphrates River dried up, a time that will facilitate, as it were, the ability for armies to come from the east to the land of Israel, toward Jerusalem. And then the seventh bowl or vial, the massive final destruction, which we read in Revelation 16, 17 through 21, whether it's earthquakes, mountains destroyed, islands disappear, great hail, is a time of great destruction. So we've looked at now several of these stages. Last time we looked at the seven seals, and we noticed that those seven seals, and then at the end of those seals there were seven trumpets. We look at those seven trumpets, and at the end of those, the seventh trumpet, we have the seven last plagues. And we've gone over then these seven last plagues today. But that's not it. It's not over with then. What comes after that? Well, as last time we looked at the storyline of the book of Revelation, we looked at Armageddon and the return of Christ. So what we have yet to see in the Bible, and we'll look at a number of the prophecies of those, we'll do that another time, is what's the sequence of events after the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven vials? Now we have the return of Christ, And here's a sequence, a timeline. Christ is seen in the clouds. God's people will be raised up to meet him in the clouds. Christ will return, standing on the Mount of Olives, where it will split in two. We will read that the Satan is bound and will be bound, and that will then initiate the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, the Christ. So we'll have that 1,000 years. So my purpose today was to make sure that we understood the storyline or the timeline of the book of Revelation. And as I've said to people, it's easy to remember things in threes. The Bible gives us these three groups of seven. So 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials, culminating then in the battle at Armageddon following the return of Jesus Christ. So I want us to understand the timeline. This timeline will give us an opportunity now now, when you say, well, why didn't we cover more? I found out this week that Mr. Fay, the deceased pastor from Chicago, gave 35 Bible studies of about an hour each, covering the book of Revelation. Okay? If you want to go deeper, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I want us to understand this. So then I thought, well, I'll do it on the imagery. We'll cover that. I had about 6 or 7 pages of all of the imagery used in the book of Revelation. We would not have time for supper before sundown today if we were to go through that. So I thought the best thing we can do here is to understand this overall timeline. So now when we go to other resources, it will start to fit together. And if you really want to get those details, you can get online at ucg.org and check out Mr. Fay's 35-part series on that, which seems to me there are 36 weeks in a normal school year, which seems to me, if you were taking this as a graduate school course, and all of you are graduates right now in the Church of God history, that it would take an entire school year to go through this. So let's be encouraged because we know the end of that story. We know it's the return of Christ that will come. And so let's seize upon our understanding. So when somebody throws something at us, you have an understanding of the story flow or of the timeline of the book of Revelation.